You know what's crazy to me? Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania and Eternals have basically the exact same Rotten Tomatoes score. Something about that just doesn't seem right. Hey everybody, welcome back to Access Blockbusters and welcome to a look back at Eternals. A film that clearly was somewhat divisive, at least amongst the MCU fans, but I'm here to tell you why you're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. That's not this kind of channel. I'm just here to share my thoughts. But it is also true that Eternals was the first MCU movie to receive a rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes, and that in itself is crazy. And so I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about. But first, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and show your support in the comments down below. Let me know what you think about Eternals, whether or not you've seen it once, twice. I would love to engage with as many of you as I can in the comments down below. Alright, as always, this video will be divided into 3 parts. The first part, I'll be giving the context about the film, when it came out, what was going on, what people were thinking before the film, what I was thinking before the film, how I thought about the film the first time I saw it, how I thought about the film afterwards, and then what I thought about the film going into the rewatch. Part 2 of the video will be not a play-by-play, but I'll be going through most of the major plot points, talking about what I liked, what I didn't like about this film in the rewatch, and then the third part will be talking about how my opinion may or may not have changed after the rewatch. Got all of that? Let's talk about Eternals. Now, even before this film came out, people were saying it looked different, and it definitely did look different. Marvel had hired Academy Award-winning director Chloe Zhao to direct the film, and the trailers just made it look like a real departure from the MCU, but in a good way, because this film is going to be exploring the mythology of the MCU and the world that the Marvel Universe inhabits. On top of that, you're introducing 10 new characters into the fold, so this was very much a Guardians of the Galaxy-esque experiment, but in a different kind of vein, not the sort of space opera-y kind of film that James Gunn was attempting to make, and it wasn't really as much of a risk in the sense that James Gunn was really branching off for the first time in the MCU, but this was still a risk, I think. And critically, obviously, that risk didn't pan out, but I think that Eternals set up a lot of interesting things, whether or not you like the film. Now, as for me, I was very much looking forward to the movie, but I didn't have many expectations for it, and when I first heard of the Rotten Tomatoes score, I was a little alarmed. Obviously, being the first Rotten MCU score to ever exist, that's, again, insane. But as I always do, I kept my expectations at the door, and I walked out of the film saying I have no idea what the critics were saying. Now, that's not me saying that every critic who didn't like the film, and every fan who doesn't like the film, and every viewer who didn't like the film is wrong. That's never my opinion, and that's never my stance. I'm just saying that, for me, I can understand there are parts of the film that don't work as well. There are parts of the film that I certainly don't love. But overall, this was an experience that I went, yeah, I mean, if I like this film as much as I did, which we'll talk about in just a second, I'm not entirely sure why so many other people didn't like the film. From what I gathered, a lot of the criticisms about the film were revolving around the fact that it was a little slow, it dragged, it felt lackluster, it didn't really feel focused, and I just couldn't disagree more, but we will talk about that. Now, I've seen Eternals a couple times since the first viewing, and each time I've liked it a little bit more, so I went into this rewatch anticipating that I'd like the movie just a little bit more, if not the same amount. And here's the thing. We'll get into why, but I actually like the movie a little bit less this time around, but I still really like the film. I really do. I think this is more of a function of me having seen the film multiple times now that I'm able to pick up on things that maybe didn't bother me as much before. I just don't think that that detracts from the overall quality of the film in general. I think that the overall film still stands up very strong, and it's near the upper echelon of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, from the very beginning, the film opens in ancient Mesopotamia, and it's a very methodical, slow kind of opening. You're not really used to that in the MCU films because a lot of MCU films like to start big and bombastic, but this opening is slow and deliberate. It even has an opening crawl, and I loved that. I love that Chloe Zhao was taking her time to explore these concepts, these big, celestial, no pun intended, well, okay, pun intended, universe-ranging consequences of these eternal beings, these beings of cosmic power, Eternals and Celestials and Deviants. I think that that was a really smart play, rather than try to shrink the entire story down. I think that the relationships between the characters were established very early on. I will say that the dialogue felt a little grandiose, but I was just chalking that up to the fact that it was a very early period in time, so I think that just watching the film, at least that prologue part through that lens, it felt, I don't know, it felt right. One of the other things that stood out to me immediately is that the visual designs, especially after having seen a lot of Phase 4 back to back to back, the visual designs in this film were quite unique. I'm a big fan of the Eternals costumes. I'm a big fan of the design of the Deviants. Sometimes they do look CGI-y for sure, but the design elements themselves, the way that they look, the menacing stances and the sort of monster-like tendrils that come out of them, I think that the Deviants look extremely cool. And the visual language of this film with the golden rings and all the shapes and circles and triangles and squares, I think that's such a unique way to tell a story through visuals as well. And even the cinematography, it just feels grand. I love the prologue of this movie. It's one of my favorite openings in the MCU. Although, one of the things that does stick out to me, especially in the beginning, and this is something that continues on throughout the entire film, and it's something I noted down a bunch in my notes, the dialogue for a lot of these characters is pretty good, but the dialogue for Icarus in particular is very clunky. At the beginning, it starts out clunky, and I assumed, okay, this is just because it's part of the prologue, but throughout the entire movie, while I think that the lines he's given are fairly good, I think the way that they told Richard Madden to deliver them, it's a little bit stilted. So then we go to present day, we meet Cersei, Sprite, Dane Whitman, who's really not a character in this movie, sorry, Kit Harington, and Icarus. The scene is cool. I think that the deviant attack is fairly standard for MCU, but, some of the visual language is, again, very interesting. And then we get this whole explanation about why Eternals don't interfere with human conflicts. Now, I've thought about this quite a bit, actually, over the past few years, and the explanation that Cersei gives to Dane is that Eternals don't interfere because they're not allowed to interfere with conflicts in the human world unless deviants are involved. And I've come to assume that that is essentially a cover-up for the fact that they just need human life to repopulate for the emergences to happen. So that's not the real reason. And so on that level, my question was, just like Dane Whitman, well, wait, when Thanos showed up, Thanos is an Eternal, kind of, because of the post-credit scenes, although maybe he's not an Eternal. I'm still waiting for that to be explained, which I hope it someday will be. But when Thanos wiped out half the universe, I'm going, okay, so it's technically not a deviant conflict, but he still wiped out half of all the universe. You don't think that the Celestials would be a little alarmed at that because, hey, we can't birth any other Celestials when half of the universe has been decimated? Feels a little weird to me. I feel like if I were Arishem, I'd be like, hey, Ajak, we need to have a talk because Earth just got cut in half by 3.5 billion people, so we have a problem. And then we get some flashbacks, and the flashbacks start early, and they appear pretty often. And I think this is probably another controversial part of the movie, something that some people really like, some people didn't like, and I personally love the flashbacks. I understand that it sort of drags down, quote-unquote, drags down the pace of the present-day parts of the film, but I think that you're learning just as much about the Eternals in the flashbacks as you are in the present day, and I think it's all about learning these characters, building them up, building up the mythology, building up the lore, and in that respect, I don't quite mind it as much, because if it were just a regular character, and then you were having flashbacks every 10 minutes about, I don't know, random things that were going on in their lives 10 years ago, doesn't quite make sense. But what I think you're building up in these flashback scenes is the camaraderie, because yes, you don't get to see Phastos until an hour and a half into the movie. You don't get to see Makkari until basically the movie's over, but you get to know them beforehand. And I think that that really goes a long way in helping build up these characters. By the way, I think that it's really incredibly impressive that Chloe Zhao was able to have each of the Eternals, all 10 of them, have a distinct characteristic or distinct set of characteristics, and even have each Eternal have a numerous amount of layers to them. There are more layers to certain Eternals for sure, but regardless, I think that for having 10 brand new characters introduced into the MCU, I feel that Chloe Zhao did about as good as she could have. I mean, we can go through them very quickly. I think Cersei's whole arc about maybe self-confidence, maybe that's not the right word, but believing in herself, believing that she has the power, even though she on the surface seems to have the lamest power set. That's an interesting arc. She loves humanity. Ajak also loves humanity, and she turns on Arishem at the last second. Icarus is obviously the soldier, and he turns into the villain because he's so loyal to Arishem, although kind of flaky towards the end. He just kind of turns into a generic MCU villain, but, you know. Sprite wants to be human. She feels left out because she's forced to stay as a child, or at least physically. Kingo is also an interesting character because he sticks with Icarus, at least in terms of his viewpoints, but he refuses to hurt his family at the end. Druid gets a lot of development in the flashback scenes because he feels like he has the power to control humans and stop them from hurting each other, but he's told not to do so. Phastos helped create the atomic bomb, which killed a bunch of people during World War II, but then he's found his love for humanity through his husband and his son. The rest of them are a little less well fleshed out. I think Gilgamesh, he died towards the middle of the film, and his whole thing was protecting Thena, which is, it's fine. Thena, I feel like, is the weakest Eternal in terms of character development. She has Mad Weary, which is a really interesting concept, but I don't think it was really taken anywhere. And I think Angelina Jolie doesn't quite know what kind of movie she's in. She's just kind of there to be Angelina Jolie. And then I think Makkari is also just kind of there, although her relationship with Druig is very cute. My point, though, with talking about each one of the Eternals is that when you get to that final argument scene towards the end where they're on the Domo and Icarus is about to betray them, you see where each one of them is coming from. You see why Kingo has to back down. You see why Sprite goes with Icarus, and then you see why all the other characters are doing what they're doing as well, because they have their own specific stances and the ways they feel about humanity. I think that just look at any character. I think especially Druig, you can find complexities within the characters. I got ahead of myself a little bit though. So anyways, they go and meet Kingo and Karun are some of the best parts of this movie. I think that the beginning part is a little bit slow and a little bit dark, but I kind of like that. But then you have your levity, and I think that this isn't just levity for levity's sake. It's not just MCU humor, I think, but rather I think it's inserted in there in a very well placed moment where I think you finally need some levity and need some humor, and Kingo and Karun, I love Karun. Another scene that I know got a lot of flack was the big world building scene where Arishem explains to Cersei what's going on. Now, I can understand why this one maybe didn't work for a lot of people, but for me, as someone who loves science fiction, loves fantasy, this kind of world building I'm a sucker for. I think maybe I wouldn't have had the Eternals just be pure synthezoids, like Vision. That makes me feel a little bit weird about it. Like, you could say Arishem just created regular beings, but anyways. But I'm just a sucker for world building. I think it makes a lot of sense. This, very tried and true conflict, the trolley problem, right? You save billions of lives by creating new celestials, but you have to kill a few planets to get there, It's a tried and true problem, and it's a very complicated one. And I will say the weakest part of the movie is definitely the middle. The part where they go and meet Druig, and the part I think it's the Amazon, where they're fighting the Deviant. And look, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, Eternals has one of the worst villains in the MCU. And I go, okay, really? And they say, yeah, Crow is such a terrible villain. Crow is the big deviant that's evolving throughout the movie. But I have to push back on that because while, yes, I think Crow is a very weak character, he's not the villain of the movie. Icarus is the villain of the movie. But anyways, going back to Crow, when he finally learns to speak in the Amazon forest, I understand that he's there to add even more complexity to the situation, that he's saying, look, Celestials created us, and then Celestials created you to kill us, and now we hate you guys, and we hate the Celestials, and all that kind of stuff. I just think that by the time you get to the end of the movie, when he and Thena are fighting, it doesn't feel like it's part of the same movie. It just doesn't feel like that's part of the conflict anymore. So I understand the point of the deviants. I think the deviants are sort of a plot device to get somewhere, but I would have much rather just not had that prime deviant evolving to the point where it had to be a major standoff at the end of the movie. It doesn't make that much sense. Although I will say, the action of the Eternals, like I said at the beginning, quite good. Quite good. Love seeing Icarus be basically Superman. Love Kingo's action visuals, the way that Makari's running around as well. Everything's good. And so when you get to the end of the movie, it's about stopping the emergence, but it's also about the philosophical differences between the Eternals. I think that Icarus works as a more complicated villain than, say, your Malekiths or your Whiplashes or whatever, because he's following his moral code. He's a soldier. He's a soldier till the end. And while, yes, him sort of diabolically killing Ajax was a little bit too far, I think that you understand his mindset, and you understand that he's not just doing it for evil's sake. Like, he believes in the mission so much that he feels like he has to stop the other Eternals to finish it. That, to me, is where the slowness of the movie works especially well. The slowness doesn't work quite as well when it's just sort of action-y and plodding along, because then it's like, yeah, okay, why are we still here? What are we doing? But when the slowness focuses on the characters having conversations, like towards the end of the movie, right before the final fight, where the characters are discussing how they feel, the philosophical elements, the moral elements, the dilemmas, I think that's when the movie's sort of quote-unquote slowness is at its strongest. And look, at the end of the movie, I mean, like I've been talking about, I think there are problems with this film, but I want an Eternal sequel so bad because I think that the concepts that are explored in this movie can be expanded upon even more. I think that Eternals films, as long as they're presented to the audience in a way that's understandable and palatable, can explain so much of the MCU. I mean, it's something as simple as, can we explain, that giant floating celestial in the middle of the ocean? That's for other MCU projects to focus on. And so far, as of the recording of this video, which is probably way in advance of when it's coming out, so I don't know, maybe they've explained it by now, but hasn't been explained yet. But I mean, things like Arishem and Judgment of Earth and things like that, Celestials, Eternals, Eternity in Thor Love and Thunder. The Eternals films are films that can explain giant concepts in the MCU in a way that makes sense to the audience and makes sense for the story. So I'm really hoping for an Eternals sequel. So like I said at the beginning, this is a film that I really enjoyed. I think that Chloe Zhao took a big swing, and whether or not you like this movie, I think that you should respect, in my opinion at least, you should respect that Chloe Zhao took a swing and made a deeper, more rich philosophical movie. May not have worked for you on that personal level, and that's okay. But for me, while I think that there are little nitpicks here and there are maybe a couple big points that I'm not a big fan of, I think that this movie is incredibly solid, and I really quite enjoy it every single time I see it. This is a franchise that I hope didn't get derailed because of the low box office, which was probably partly because of the pandemic, but also because of the low critic reaction. I hope that didn't derail, Kevin Feige's plans for the Eternals, whatever they were at the time and whatever they are now, because I really enjoy these characters and I hope to see them again soon. So those are my thoughts on Eternals after rewatching the film. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Let me know if you like these kind of videos. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next one.